As we all know by now, police and politics have been trying to curb our civil rights to petition against unfair and unjust treatment for some time, inciting reactions from peaceful protesters so they can get heavy-handed and falsely accuse people of public order offences. More recently, suggesting that protests are illegal under the coronavirus regulations. Well, now it seems that while most of government have very little to do, some idiot has come up with the great idea of giving police more powers to attack those holding and attending protests, or protests that disrupt transport or businesses. Now granted, the powers are meant to help prevent violent protests, but as we all know, the police are generally the ones who incite the violence in many cases. Let's face it, the best way to get a reaction is to threaten someone with either an unlawful arrest or threat of harm with one of the Podstar multitude of weapons. What this is doing is giving police a broad spectrum of discretion to abuse, making assumptions that someone's business is being affected or disrupted. I mean, I can't imagine the police entering a store and asking if they've had less customers due to the protests that's occurring nearby. They'll simply make the assumption and arrest you. Who, after all, is going to determine whether someone shouting to be heard comes under a violent spectrum? Of course, it will be the police. Then they will gang up several strong and all attempt to put hands on you, which of course you will resist, and in the process be accused of resisting arrest and assault on an emergency worker. Can you see where this is going? This will be used to target the leaders of these protests in the hope that the fear of being arrested will filter down and people will stop protesting altogether. Now, the mainstream media are reporting on groups such as Extinction Rebellion being the target of these new powers. But as we already know all too well, if you give the police powers of discretion to use new powers, they will ultimately abuse on anyone and everyone they possibly can. Priti Patel and Justice Secretary Robert Buckland say the measures will allow police to safely manage protests which threaten public order or stop people from getting on with their daily lives, which is already in the legislation. But static protests that are allowed to go ahead will have to abide by police limits on their duration, location and noise levels. A Home Office source said, "We saw the impact of protests by crusty eco-crusaders on freedom of speech. The right to protest is a cornerstone of our democracy, and Priti fundamentally supports the principle of freedom of speech to ensure people can express their views peacefully. But the disruption caused by some lefty protests has exposed an emerging threat to our way of life, our economy, and the livelihoods of the hard-working majority." Now, as much as I hate to say it, it's incredible that the media are calling out the left over their protesting rather than the right. Although, to be fair, there are groups on both sides that have bad ideas on how to conduct a protest. The full measures will be laid out in the wide-ranging Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Bill. Describing the bill as the most radical overhaul in decades, the Cabinet Ministers will introduce laws which extend whole life prison terms to premeditated child murderers and to the most dangerous offenders aged between 18 and 20, unless they are paedophiles or police, of course. The fact is that every time they say they will be tougher on certain criminals committing the most heinous crimes, they still all seem to get a better deal than those people who commit much lesser crimes. I still know of someone who's been in prison for 15 years for stealing a push bike, while we speak often on the channel of paedophiles being given suspended sentences. On Thursday, Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary and Fire and Rescue Services published its plans for the future of policing protests, 2 days after the government announced the proposed new laws granting more powers to police. The report, ordered by Priti Patel following Extinction Rebellion and Black Lives Matter protests, outlines a need to develop covert intelligence gathering methods and an expectation of increased use of facial recognition, despite a Court of Appeal ruling last year that its use in South Wales breached privacy rights and broke equalities law. But then who cares what a court of law says when you're the one writing the laws? After all, it's not like anyone in government will be held accountable for breaking them, is it? Emmanuel Andrews, Policy and Campaigns Officer at Liberty, said these plans were a staggering assault on our right to protest, as well as an attack on other fundamental rights. Police already have extensive powers to restrict protests and frequently go beyond them, even though it is their duty to facilitate the exercise of this right. We are still in the grip of a pandemic that has changed all our lives, handed enormous powers to the government, and dramatically restricted our protest rights. The proposals in the policing bill are an opportunistic bid from the government to permanently erode our rights. We must reject the politics of division that the government is exploiting through this bill and protect each other and our ability to stand up to power. Kevin Blow, campaign's coordinator of the police monitoring group Netpol, criticised the report as alarming and illiberal, and essentially a series of recommendations on how you can massively expand surveillance on protest movements at a time when the government has decided that it's going to crack down on those protests. The report is the first to feature the term aggravated activists instead of domestic extremists, the use of which Netpol campaigned against for almost a decade. It defines aggravated activists as those who commit protest-related crime or unlawful behaviour. The most frequent level of aggravated activism associated with protests is said to be low. Matt Parr from HMICFRS said, "The right to gather and express our views is fundamental to our democracy, but this is not an absolute right. The police need to strike the correct balance between the rights of protesters and the rights of others, such as local residents and businesses. We found that the police too often do not find the balance between protecting the rights of the protesters and preventing excessive disruption to daily life, which even peaceful protests can sometimes cause." So the HMICFRS say that police will ultimately be determining what they individually deem to be unlawful by creating such a broad bill that will enable police to quite literally attack protesters for just about any reason. I said yesterday that the Bill of Rights gives us the right to petition against unfair and unjust treatment, and the right to protest is an absolute right. It's when you cause someone harm, loss or damage in the process when it becomes a problem, because then you are in fact breaking a law. This is true even in the face of bullshit coronavirus legislation. This wide-ranging new bill is simply another clever attempt to stifle our voices and prevent us from holding those in power to account. Very big thank you to channel supporters, especially these guys. Your support is truly appreciated. Don't forget to like, share, comment and subscribe. Let me know your thoughts, as I know many of you will. And until next time, stay safe, look after each other, film the police and other officials.